In terms of what we've been doing, what I'm going to do is basically tell you a wee bit about Waterways Ireland. I'm going to start with a short overview of the waterways in Ireland, which I'm sure many in the room could write. It's just a quick skip through their history. I'm going to talk in particular about the records that we hold and how we came to them. I'm going to look at what are the challenges that we face. And I'm also then going to give you a brief outline of what our action plan is, what we've done, and also where we hope to go. And really coming here today is very much to help us make contacts and work out where we're going to go. So in terms of that, I have some pictures of transportation on the waterways. The Waterways Archive we hold is only a very small section of the story of the waterways as a transport system in Ireland. You will know people have lived along the waterways since prehistoric times. The Shannon, the Bann and Lough Erne were all natural navigations at a time when movement around the country was by water because the land was covered in dense forest. From the hunter-gatherers of 9,000 years ago foraging on the shores of the lakes and rivers to the Neolithic settlers, some 5,000 years later, early man was drawn to the waterways. As Ireland became more developed, a picture emerges of the importance of the rivers and lakes, not only as a means of transport and commerce for establishing communities, but also very important sites for monastic settlements like at Clonmacnoise and on Devonish Island. The waterways were also strategically important in the continuing struggles for power and supremacy among the Irish chieftains, and later in the battles against the raiding parties of the Vikings. And I find it fascinating that it's noted in the Annals of Ulster that the Fermanagh chieftains, the Maguires, maintained a fleet of 1,500 boats on Lough Erne in their efforts to defend their territory against invading clans. And I think that's particularly important because 1,500 boats, there are about 5,500 boats now on Lough Erne in this modern age. So it was quite a number by anyone's measure. For the 18th century, transportation was by sail and oar, and it wasn't until the increase in enthusiasm for building and improving navigations that this method changed, and the construction of the Newry Canal in 1741, the first of its kind in the British Isles, kick-started the canal building frenzy of the late 18th and early 19th century. It is from this period that the bulk of the Waterways Ireland archive derives. A number of proposals for linking Dublin to the east to the Shannon in the west were first mooted in the mid-18th century. The construction of a canal between the two would provide a faster and more convenient route for transporting fuel and produce, and in 1755 two alternative routes were submitted, and the most southerly route, the route of the Grand Canal, was approved for construction. In typically Irish fashion, a dispute arose, and controversially a disgruntled director decided to build a river canal but using the route that had been rejected, and hence we have the Royal Canal. There were a great many problems with the construction of both canals. The Grand Canal was not completed until 1803, and the huge engineering difficulties included the problem of crossing the Bog of Allen, which is still a problem for us today in maintaining the canal through the Bog of Allen, with construction taking 47 years. The Royal Canal, meanwhile, only took 27. Initially, only cargo goods were carried, but soon passenger services were being offered to the public. Towed by horse along the canal banks, barges took 18 hours to reach the Shannon from Dublin, and it was not unusual for passengers to share their cabin space with a cargo of pigs. Faster boats, the flyboats, were pulled by horses and achieved speeds of 15 miles per hour and accommodated up to 15 kilometres per hour and accommodated up to 52 passengers, which was 3 times faster than before. The slower boats were retained for nighttime travel and were used primarily by the lower classes. So popular were the passenger boats on the canals that the Grand Canal Company built 5 hotels to accommodate travellers, the first Irish chain of hotels, with similar hotels constructed on the Shannon and the Erne. The Grand Canal is reported in its heyday to have carried 100,000 passengers a year, up to the mid-1800s, while the Royal Canal attracted a more modest 40,000 passengers. The waterways are not just a history of the general public and transport, but they were also used by the military in the movement of troops. And it was not uncommon for the militia stationed at the Curragh in County Kildare to travel to Dublin via the canal during periods of public unrest in the 1790s. The army actually provided security for the barge companies. The arrival of the two canals linking the capital city with the Shannon highlighted the navigational problems which had beset the Shannon and which authorities had struggled with unsuccessfully for a number of years. At this time, only intermittent stretches of the river were navigable, which meant that if you were travelling via one of the passenger boats, you would have to disembark, travel on the next by jaunting car till you got to the next navigation stretch. And throughout the 1830s, the Shannon Commissioners were producing reports and recommendations on how best to improve the navigation. And when finally funds were made available, work commenced on improving the river. This extensive scheme of works carried out between 1839 and 1846 involved the deepening of significant stretches, construction of huge weirs, locks, blockhouses, the rebuilding of many bridges, all of which greatly improved navigation and allowed greater movement. Improvement works were also carried out on the lower Bann during the same period, while the River Barrow had received similar treatment in the late 1700s. The advent of steam saw the arrival of the great paddle steam passenger boats, among them the most famous 19th century Shannon steamers. There was the Lady Lansdowne, the Lady Betty Balfour and the Countess of Erne. And the SS Belturbet all plied their trade on the Erne. And we have several public notices in our archive collection informing travellers of the summer and winter timetables. However, the era of the railways arrived, and I know there are many railway enthusiasts here today, and sadly began the slow decline of the canals. The railways were faster, they could reach more destinations, and quickly became the preferred mode of transport. Apart from a brief revival of trade during World War II, the Irish government reverted when the Irish government reverted to using the old barges to transport people to Dublin during the Fuhrer crisis during the war. The demise of the canals had officially begun. The Royal Canal closed in 1961, and the Grand Canal would have followed suit but for the determination of local interest groups and volunteers who lobbied the government to keep it open. And it's a testament to the interest of people in the organisations you represent that the canals are here today. After years of neglect, however, the Royal Canal was restored and reopened in 2010 by Waterways Ireland. And these are just pictures from our archive and some from the National Records. We're very fortunate in that a lot of the history is still living, in that many of the Guinness barges still are in the hands of the Heritage Boat Association and are regularly used on the waterways. Sorry, I hit something that is thrown off the... I've leant on the mouse. As if there was a mouse on the podium. This has obviously stopped it. That should do it. Go back one. There you are. I'm going to talk a wee bit about Waterways Ireland because I'm not sure how much any of you know about us. We're one of the north-south bodies that arose out of the peace agreement. We were formed by statute in 1999 and came into being in 2000. We're the largest of the 6 north-south bodies, and our remit is to manage, maintain, promote and protect, primarily for recreational purposes, the inland navigations in Ireland. And you can see the dark blue lines represent what we look after. In terms of our duties, we have 7 navigations which run from St Mullins, almost down at Waterford on the Barrow, right up through the Shannon navigation, the Shannon-Erne waterway, which was the Ballyconnell Canal, into the Erne system, and we also look after the lower Bann. And of course the missing links are the Lagan Canal, the Ulster Canal, which would reconnect navigation through to Belfast and up to the north coast. We work for 2 departments, 2 jurisdictions, and report to the North-South Ministerial Council. So whatever your view of bureaucracy is in a government body, multiply it by a factor of about 22. And in terms of resources, we're funded 85% by the southern government, 15% by the northern government, and that represents the length of jurisdiction that is in both countries. Our budget is in excess of 25 million a year, which sounds enormous until you examine 1,000 kilometres of navigation. We own hundreds of bridges, 360 kilometres of canals, 420 if you count disused canals, thousands of culverts, sumps, back drains. It's a massive infrastructure. And we've 320 staff who are spread throughout the country, headquarters being in Enniskillen. Enniskillen is where the archive is, and it's an open building. You'd all be very welcome there. In terms of what we do, obviously our primary directive is to manage the navigation. I see the first card up. And really, you can see here, this is one of our workboats. We spend 90% of our resources actually running the navigations. All the nuts and bolts and lots of the things you don't see. Our inspectorate, who are actually a handful of 7 people, enforce the bylaws, but primarily we're a recreational resource, and prosecution is a very last resort. But that is a function. In terms of development, we have installed, over the period when there was lots of money, there has been a step change in the quality and the quantity of facilities available on our inland navigations. And throughout the country now, they are world-class recreational resources. If you go anywhere in Europe, we have onshore and adjacent facilities that are world-class. And that money has been well spent, and those resources will be there in 50 and 100 years' time. There are harbours and moorings that have been created that hopefully we'll be able to sustain. As an organisation looking forward, what we're doing very much is saying, now that money is very limited and the organisation has a reducing budget, it will have fallen by 30% come the end of this year in the past 4-year period, and is likely to decline by another 7 or 8% next year. So that gives you a feel for some of the financial challenges we have. We're very much looking at it and saying, how can we add value? How can we attract more people to use these existing resources? What are the broader uses that can be made of these navigations in terms of on the canals, walking, cycling, encouraging greater people to use them? It's a huge public recreational estate that runs the length of the country. So we're very much focused on how, for a small expenditure, can we add value and see more people take benefit from that. And you can see here some of the programs that we're involved in. We have a very active role in terms of marketing the inland navigations, and one of our projects is the Inland Waterways and Lakelands Initiative, which really is creating a focus for both tourist bodies on what is the Midlands tourist offering. But our remit is for everyone. It's manage, maintain, promote and protect, primarily for recreational purposes. So local people, tourists, good facilities are good for everyone. Moving on then, the Waterways Ireland Archive. Our archive really retells the story of the Shannon and the canals, and it's about the works to make them navigable. From the earliest maps of Dublin dated 1717 to the bulk of the collection, which is from 1830s onwards. The technical drawings, toll books and reports all have their own story to tell. Locks, bridges, weirs, overflows, cranes, wharfs and a host of smaller features are all in our archive and have been preserved and stored by successive navigation authorities because they were working documents. Now when I say preserved and stored, it was in a very wide range of manners. The documents were originally held in temporary storage by us until we moved to our new headquarters in 2008 in Enniskillen, where they have found a permanent home and we have an archive room. They were painstakingly drawn by hand, and the genius of the original designers of the navigation structures is reflected in the intricate detail of the structures. We have, come on in, you're very welcome. Have a seat. With a collection of some 4,500 original maps, drawings, toll books, reports and loose letters, all of which pertain to the construction of the Irish inland waterways. The archive was created in the course of the functions and activities of the commissioners, of the engineers who built them. And we still use these today When we go to do work a couple of years ago in Athlone, we wanted to do temporary repairs to the lock gates there. It's 40,000 boat movements a year, a very important facility for us. We hadn't the money to carry out extensive repairs, so the engineers go back to the original drawings, and that's how they determine the work that needs to be done. From our point of view, the archive is currently resourced on request. Our own engineers from within Waterways Ireland, we get requests from the public who are researching family history, and we get quite a lot of requests from the media who are researching various programmes. For example, again, going back to Athlone, the BBC did a programme on the development of Athlone a number of years ago and drew extensively on our records of the bridges and the development of the navigation there. I suppose the challenges for us were, and make the rest of my slide here, resources. Really up until we moved the archive to our new headquarters in 2008, we hadn't done an awful lot with it. We, throwing me now with a 5-minute card. So, Nuala came into post, and over the last 2 years we've made a real effort to catalogue our archive. It had been catalogued in various places, it had been stored, but we've made a real effort to catalogue it, which we've now dealt with. Although a couple of months ago we got a phone call from OPW saying we're clearing out a store in Hazelhatch and we've discovered a load of drawings from the Ulster Canal. Would you like to have them? Which of course we said yes. So that's a work in progress. There are also gaps in our archive. Our archive is largely engineering drawings, and something we would like to do when we're making it accessible is to have much more photographs. Now, we're not proposing to try and increase that dramatically, but we're certainly interested in cooperating with other people's archives to see how we can enrich the material we hold. And access. It's limited in terms of if you have to come to Enniskillen, you have to come during our office hours in terms of making it accessible. So we've developed an action plan to try and address this. We have got ourselves together and developed a management policy. So actually, how would we look after this archive rather than in the perhaps ad hoc fashion that had developed with engineers over the years. We also are working to improve the access, and I'll speak about how we're going to do that, and promotion of it. How do we let people know what we hold? We feel quite often people stumble on our records or through word of mouth. They know someone who's met someone who knows we might have something. And finally, how do we move forward in partnership with our limited resources, but we do have resources to make more value and make it more accessible. In terms of our action plan, the collections management, we've been working with PRONI and with the National Records Office in the South to understand how to actively archive it. We employed an archivist a couple of years ago who helped us start out on that plan. We also resourced ways to preserve it, low-cost ways I might add, and we were very grateful for the advice we got. So at least what we have is now secure and won't deteriorate. We also have had to look at acquisitions. We were very fortunate last weekend. The Heritage Boat Association gave us a Bollinger engine, which is the first engines were put in the Guinness barges when they moved from being horse-drawn. And I was a bit annoyed that Alan had brought props. I didn't know you could bring props. So he's definitely one up on us. But from our point of view, we don't have a capacity, we don't have massive storage, so how do we go forward? How do we take things that were being offered? Thankfully I haven't been offered shaving knives yet, but I'm sure. And finally, we're working to an accreditation, working to standards that are internationally recognised, so that what we do preserves the archive and makes it accessible for people as we go forward. In terms of access, our solution has been, we do have a reading room in headquarters that we make available, but essentially we are going down the route of making the collection available online. We are digitising all of the documents that we hold, and that's a process we hope to finish this year. It's involved a little expenditure for us in terms of the larger documents cost €2 and smaller ones are €1. But when you consider the scale, it's a very modest sum of money. And again, Nuala has been working to create a micro website within the Waterways Ireland website we'll be able to link into and see what's there and search it effectively. A lot of this is based around our IT work in terms of our website development. Again, because we had money, we've been able to use our own IT team, who I have to say have been excellent in getting to grips with an area of work they probably weren't as familiar with. Moving forward, we also want to look at how we can create online educational resources, but we're only in our infancy in doing that. And again, we're here to make contacts and hear your ideas about how we might do that. And we also want to promote the archive through our own website. It's a very extensive website in that it promotes the navigations. It provides how to license your boat, how to buy a map. We're now making the navigation, actual guides that you use boating, available online. This again is about our digitisation, how we did it. This slide sort of breezes through things that took us months to wrestle through. I didn't know what metadata was, but just trying to work through getting it right, getting the coding right so that it actually makes sense in a wider perspective of archives. We did outsource the digitisation. It wasn't something we could do on site, and that's been our external cost, which we expect by the end of the year to have cost us about €5,000. Looking forward, things we'd like to do would be to improve our educational resources and the use of the archive. We have an exhibition space in our own headquarters, which we'd very much like to develop in partnership with other organisations to have an ongoing programme of exhibitions. I mean, in my opening remarks, our archive is particularly about the engineering drawings, but there is a history in the waterways that we could think of a new topic every week, forever, and probably not have to think very hard what the next one might be. The wealth of material is enormous. Nuala and I talked on the way down about some of the projects we have done. For example, we did a project in Tarmanbarry, where the secondary school there were doing a history project around the bridge in Tarmanbarry, and they used our archive to access material about the development of that bridge in partnership with the National Records Office. Other things we've done is given, well, we certainly haven't given talks to interested groups, but we're working with local historians to facilitate that, and participating in Heritage Week. But we're only scraping the surface on this. Really, over the last 2 years, we've got our archive in order. We've catalogued it. We'll have digitised it by the end of this year. I'm really looking forward now. It's how do we use this resource. And this is our action plan. We do have a programme of press and PR. We are involved in social media, and we see that as an avenue for being able to tell local stories and draw people's attention to it. We take that forward as part of our mainstream work in terms of promoting the waterways. We haven't looked at the whole, the attraction of how we can use this heritage to draw people to visit our waterways. And that's a key thing for us going forward. I spoke in terms of our focus now is how do we increase use? And this is something we haven't begun to unlock yet. How do we use the heritage on the Shannon to attract people to the Shannon to explore and understand that very rich heritage? My time is up, so I'm not going to witter on. I'm going to take questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. And Dawn has set the pace and very hard act to follow, whether you have visual aids or even practical samples outside to follow. But yes, we'll start off talking about the title here of Maintaining the Road by Heating Tar, Surface Dressing Process. Talk for a few minutes about materials, about methods, the early days, the Road Surface Treatment Association today, and then follow on very, very quickly onto the tar boiler restoration. So down through the years, ever since Telford and McAdam built the wonderful roads in the UK, we've endeavoured to provide the travelling public with a safe, economic, durable surface. Traditionally, these, and for economic reasons, this would involve local materials. Local materials were being used in the form of a dry-bound macadam, named after John Loudon, the Scotsman. A dry-bound, and then that progressed to a wet-bound. So they sprayed water onto it to try and get it to adhere together and bound together. And although these materials were structurally sound, they were able to carry the vehicles, they became unacceptable during the winter conditions. It's not hard to imagine what happened with the tracks of vehicles, etc. with that. And then in the dry weather, which we didn't have too much of a problem in Ireland with, but in other parts of the UK, in the dry conditions, lots of dust. And so with the advent of the horseless carriages, as they talked about in the early 1900s, it was considered unacceptable to have such difficulties when travelling on the roads. Consequently, one finds the introduction of a tar spraying process as a most acceptable and most economic method of suppressing dust and sealing the surface to inhibit the ingress of water, and thus reducing the rotting on the road surface. Consequently, surface dressing, as we know it, was considered to be one of the most economic and cost-effective road maintenance techniques available to the road authority. Some of the original binders in construction. The original binders in Sweden were oil, and if you went to Palestine, Israel, Middle East, you'd find that salt was a binder. Reading the scriptures, you'd find that you're the salt of the earth. If the salt has lost its savour, wherewith shall it be rendered useless and fit for nothing but to be trod under the foot of man. So the salt in the olden days was actually used to make the roads in the Middle East as a binder. But in these islands, tar was the binder, and it was discovered to be a very acceptable binder. And you can see here the drums of tar being delivered. It would seal the surface. It was a derivative from the gas industry, the town gas as we know it. Long before Mr. Phoenix and Mr. Caller came onto the scene. So I'd said the old town gas, as some of us can remember, those from Larne or from Portadown or Coleraine or Belfast would appreciate, Carrickfergus would appreciate the old town gas system. It was a byproduct and a wonderful glue for roads and for outhouses and felt roofs. I can remember my late father sending me for pots of tar from the gasworks to then tar the shed roofs to stop water permeating through. This was the primary binder which was used by the authorities in the early 1900s. One prestige surface dressing contract which was worthy of note was the Ards TT racing circuit, which was surfaced with tar in 1929. Now, setting the scene, to meet the growing challenge and the demand of this tar, McCreath Taylor became tar importer, supplying tar in 40-gallon drums, that's in old money, or timber barrels from their tar works at Northern Road here in the Harbour Estate. And they supplied to numerous companies around the province. And you can see here, this is Govers of Moneymore. They were supplied to. And that company is now owned by Northstone, CRH, the parent company, and a road contractor. Moving on, the quarry owner or the quarry master would be responsible for supplying piles of stone, usually half-inch in old money or 14mm stones, to be stockpiled along the route which they were going to surface dress. And recesses can be seen in places such as the Antrim Coast Road. That's the most beautiful road in the world for those of you from across the mainland. Built in 1842 for £42,000. It was a real bargain, and was really an unemployment relief scheme to employ the unemployed people of the glens of Antrim. And along that road you'll find these little recesses, stone recesses, and those were used to stockpile chippings. And you can find them in other places now along throughout the province. Northern Ireland has been most fortunate to have an abundance of aggregate. We are most fortunate because you don't have to travel too far to find a quarry. At the last count there was 104 active quarries supplying stone and aggregate. And you can see here there are hundreds of sources, some of them legal and some of them not legal, sources of aggregate throughout the province. And today, you can find in England, most of the motorways, and particularly in the southeast of England, you find have been surfaced by Northern Ireland stone, exported by people such as Lagan, head office just across the way here, RMC, Northstone and Conexpo. They've shipped to not only England but also into mainland Europe, and I'm involved presently in a major contract of the major motorway running from Rotterdam to the German border being surfaced with Northern Ireland stone. So we've been very fortunate to have a tremendous facility of stone, and you can see here that the counting down grit stones here, the grey wackies, and then the Antrim basalts, and then you go down into the limestones of Fermanagh, South Tyrone, that area there. So the tremendous facilities available. The methods used, well, you can see here some of the methods used, and you can see the facilities, the old tar boiler here, different brand, but it's the same principle, and the squad of men working there. And like all good men, they always needed their tea at the appropriate time. But 10 minutes, right, okay. I thought I'd scored 10 there. Strictly come dancing. Okay. Expenditure, this is a small industry. Surface dressing wasn't a small industry. In the 1980s, you were talking about 100 million in the UK, mainland. 100 million pounds. You're talking about 20 million in the south of Ireland. And you're talking about 5 million in the north of Ireland. So that was big money being spent on surface dressing. Or as the Americans talk about chip seals. They talk about chip seals. But that was one method of surfacing the road. It's worthy to note, and I always like to tell my English colleagues this, that asphalt, as we know it, surfacing was first laid on highly trafficked routes, and it was laid in Paris in the Rue de Rivoli in 1863. That's recorded by Charles Dickens. It was laid in Belfast in 1866, and it was only laid in London at Threadneedle Street in 1869. So 3 years ahead of our English colleagues with asphalt. So it's the simple difference today is that tar is prohibited. It's not acceptable because it was proved in the latter end of the 20th century that it was carcinogenic and caused cancer. So the last tar really that has been used would be the dense tar surfacing many years ago at Aldergrove International Airport. So tar has been banned simply because of its effect on health. To replace the tar, we have used bitumen, petroleum derivative, and modern tar dressing, surface dressing machines. You can see here the chippings, and there's the binder, and that must have been my researcher's pound I squeezed out of it. And the modern equipment today is absolutely fantastic. You see, and it's changed greatly from the Navi shovels, the long-tailed shovels, possibly even made by Patterson Spade Mill and Temple Patrick, and the scavenging brushes which have been used would have been produced by the workshop for the blind people in Belfast. But now we're into the Phoenix chipper and all sophistication here, all singing, all dancing machines, and you can see the spray bars here and the real train of equipment. Very, very efficient system, and it's become a real scientific operation with students, former students gaining doctorates in the study of it and all the rest of it. So a tremendous amount of work has been developed. But today I want to talk for a few minutes at my disposal about the old tar boiler there. And this is a gentleman here which I must pay tribute to. if it hadn't been for this gentleman, Peter Johnson and Great Taylor, well, the tar boiler would never have been restored. So we can appreciate that surface dressing is a engineering feat, and it's also an art as well. But this piece of engineering workmanship to bring this bit back into existence has really been a work of art in itself. Restoring this equipment has involved the use of many tradesmen and craftsmen who patiently and lovingly breathed back into this old wreck, the tar boiler, and you can see it there in the background. That's the condition it was in when Peter actually recovered it. It began its life in Humber Bridge in Lancashire in England, having been built by the Municipal Appliances Company. Now, this company in 1923, under the names of Dewhurst, Molyneux and Dewhurst and Noon, they lodged a number of patents or patents relating to this portable machine. Such things as a safety harness straps for horses in case the horse would bolt, and obviously carrying the hot tar. So they had quick release straps on it. So that was a patentable product. They also logged for vehicle apparatus which would pump a vertical pipe to feed horizontal spray bar. They also logged a firebox extending across the width of the boiler. They also logged a preheating deck. So you can see how it evolved. And finally they applied for an apparatus for delivering measured quantities of hot tar. So it was evolving and developing. In 2012, McCreath Taylor, particularly under the drive and initiative of Peter Johnson, assisted by their consultant Patsy Connolly from Shantonach in County Monaghan, have restored the boiler to its original condition. And there it is today, and you can see it outside if you have 5 minutes. The machine was originally being bought by Down County Council under the County Surveyor, R.H.S. Patterson, or Harold Scott Patterson. So it's an interesting name. We've been trying to discover if there's any relation to the famous County Londonderry surveyor Harold Scott. He became chairman of the ICE Northern Ireland branch, and he was a major in the Second World War, and he purchased this as the county engineer and brought it to Down County Council. With the McCrory report of 1973, McCrory must have been come out. The reorganisation of local government in Northern Ireland, the tar boiler was transferred to the DOE, as it was known, Department of the Environment, Road Service. Willingly or unwillingly, like a number of staff, they were transferred, and that then became the DRD, Department of Regional Development, Northern Ireland Public Service. The tar boiler, or the pot boiler, was acquired from Road Service, and after a considerable amount of work, it was considered an item worthy of industrial archaeological restoration and preservation. It's been offered to the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum, but they declined to accept it. Nevertheless, due to the approval of the Senior Roads Authority engineers and the persistence of Peter Johnson, the tar boiler was able to escape the scrap merchant torch, and it has been restored, lovingly restored, thanks to the work of Patsy Connolly, who himself is a committee member of the Society of Mills and Millers of Ireland. And this organisation encourages the preservation of mills and part of our heritage. And his three sons also worked on the restoration, and I think if you look at it, you'll agree it's been not only a work of art, but a work of engineering to bring it back into existence. In conclusion, what can I say? It's only with foresight and the some of the county councils who have used the facilities of Big Taylor down through the years, and contractors who supplied the material. It's only with the foresight and the preservation of people like Peter Johnson that this equipment, this tar boiler, is now being restored and for generations to come to appreciate. It's a wonderful example of someone's vision. And I personally like to pay tribute to Peter for his work in saving this old tar boiler for generations to come. And these are some of the contractors. Some of them are still in existence today. John McQuillan and McCluskey's and Willie Johnson, James Boyd. Some of these contractors are still in existence today, family-owned firms who have used the facilities in Big Taylor and the importation, not only of tar but recently bitumen. And can I finally, in closing, just say, on your behalf, on behalf of the rest of us, Peter, thank you very much for doing this work. Thank you very much.
My talk today is based on the archives of the Irish Railway Records Society, which is a voluntary body founded in 1946 and whose archives are based in the old goods office in Houston Station, Dublin. The statutory records of those companies that came into what is today CIE, Chorus and Perrin, the rail companies, are held in the basement of Houston Station. So we don't have board minutes, but the rest, be they operational matters, be they non-current engineering drawings, we hold. My experience is based on writing a PhD thesis on the operation of Ireland's premier rail company, the Great Southern Railway, during the period of 1939 to 1945. It was a period of an undeclared trade war between Britain and Ireland, and the Irish Civil Service records are almost entirely disappeared. What made it possible for me to write it was acquiring in about 100 black plastic sacks the files of the Great Southern Railway from 1938 to 1948. So the first slide is to remind us that the railway was more than just the Iron Road. That's a toll book of the Royal Canal in 1846 at Dublin, and we have a run of those toll books from about 1846 to 1866. The railways owned other stuff. They ran hotels, and we have a good run of files detailing the day-to-day operation of hotels in places as far as Killarney, Rostrevor, Greenore and Bundoran. They also operated bus services and lorry services, and from the 1930s were allowed to compulsorily acquire their competitors. And we hold the due diligence files of all of the lorry operators in the Republic of Ireland which were acquired. They also were in the forefront of developing air services. So when Aer Lingus commissioned their official history, the file that told them about the foundation of Aer Lingus, including such boring stuff as what should we pay pilots, or can we have a design for the tail, was in fact, it only survived in the Railway Records Society. So the next slide tells us about, go on, do the maths. The railway was a huge employer of staff, and from 1903 it was recruited by open competitive examination. For the Great Southern and Western Railway, which is the south and west of Ireland, we have a complete run of exam files from about 1903 to 1924. And in some cases they obviously include the order of candidates, the candidates' personnel files, and in some cases the exam scripts. I don't know why and on what basis. There's arithmetic, commerce, English composition, and then you have a choice of a foreign language. You have Latin, you have French, and from 1906 you have Gaelic, which also allows you to interrogate, in some cases, people's political opinions. So I've spoken to a professor at St Patrick's College of Education in Dublin, the education department, who says that by and large stuff like that don't survive education or exam papers and scripts. Now we get down to genealogy, what we call them when we're open on a Tuesday night, ancestor worshippers. And this is the file for Tralee, County Kerry Station from about 1915 to 1916. Now, if we interrogate this and do like a policeman and slap it around the place and get it to give up its secrets, what do we see? Well, the first thing we see is in 1915 and 1916, when employers were supposed to facilitate recruitment to the army, the Great Southern Western Railway was recruiting an awful lot of individuals. And here we see this man here was arrested by police in connection with a charge of intimidation, which could not be proven. Now, that volume is currently being photographed and is going to be taken off access. Because, for example, if you go to Cork Station, you'll see a man called Charlie Daly who was shot by masked men in 1920. In fact, he was shot by auxiliary policemen. And 2 entries further down, there's a man called John Sullivan Lynch who just said kidnapped and shot. He was kidnapped and shot by the IRA and was buried in a bog, and his body was never found. You will also find, for example, people who, people returning from the army, people going to the army, people dying. We are what on this island is being called a decade of commemoration, which started in 2012 with the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Ulster Covenant, and will end in 2023 with the end of the Irish Civil War. So that particular book, which covers that period, is going to be mauled out of existence if we don't take it off access. So that has been photographed. A man came in to me one night and said, in relation to this company, my father lost his job on the railway during the Black and Tan times. And it struck me as a bit odd, because most people who got sacked for a period got their jobs back for political purposes. However, the grandfather had not told a lie, because he had been dismissed from the railway in 1920. However, the dismissal was marked in a file called Pillage of Porter, Kingsbury. And the one thing to remember about family is they always tell you lies. Everyone comes in about their grandfather, the engine driver. Nobody wants to know about their grandfather who maintained the track on which the engine ran. And the other thing, of course, is pre-electrification. Every factory had a boiler, and the boiler was generally tended by a man called an engine driver. And some people, in one case a professional genealogist, was quite annoyed when I said, no, this man was never saw a railway in his life. So anyway, that's the file ledger. This is from the Great Northern Railway, and the Great Northern Railway survived as a cross-border entity until 1958, so we hold an awful lot of stuff in relation to Northern Ireland. And this is, for a start, to tell you what was thought of in 1914. Somebody was told, probably in Belfast, go down to a printer and get a load of red cards printed up. And what do we call it? Call it the European War. Because it was not a world war. It was a European war. But the card indexes can be both a heaven and hell for the researcher. The heaven is like, they've got a nice crimson card for everyone who served in World War I. What's not to like? The hell is they can be broken up. So for example, the Great Northern Railway, they were broken up. That's broken 3 ways. We have the people who had retired by 1958, the rest went to CIE and the UTA, and we don't know where they are. And the other hell is, the previous one allows you to do geographic analysis for a particular station. You can't do that with a card index. Now, this is from, the railway produces every week a thing called a weekly circular, which gives special trains, engineering works and the like. And this is from 1913 and includes swapping of units for, it says the 24th Brigade, that's a typo, it's the 24th Battery of the Royal Field Artillery. And you notice a consideration that lavatory carriages for women and children to be supplied as far as possible. So we won't ask what the uncouth soldiers did. But anyway, you can see that trundling along at about 20 miles an hour. And that is excellent, not just for the military, although that information becomes sparse after 1914 and very sparse after 1916, but also sporting events. Now, this is the only image that has been previously published, and this is February 1915, and it relates to recruitment. And here we have them saying, a list was subsequently furnished by Mr. Linton at the request of Secretary of the names and addresses of clerical staff. Return of wages staff not to be furnished. Okay. So here we have a company which was run by a pillar of the Southern Unionist establishment, a man who in 1917 became part of the Irish Privy Council, saying to the military authorities, thanks but no thanks. The guys who are most likely to recruit and volunteer we'll keep to ourselves. Thank you very much. The intelligence officer's dream is what they call a walk-in case. It's when somebody walks in off the street and hands you up the goods. This is a walk-in case. The daughter of P.A. Foley from Dublin came in and said, my father was at work on Easter Monday 1916. He was working in the telegraph office of Amiens Street. So the army operating in the northeast segment of the British city would normally have used the GPO, but that was otherwise occupied and not available. So they came in and said to your man, start sending telegrams, and he did, but he kept copies. And the first line of communication was to the station foreman in Great Victoria Street in Belfast to go and establish contact with the commander in Belfast. And this is reference 995. We asked 15th Brigade, that's in Belfast, to send what trained men they could spare. We sent again, no message through. So that's the line of communication being set up. It also tells us what people thought. Because if you were on the ground in a British military operation in Dublin with people shooting at you, given what had gone before, you would have assumed that the same, if not worse, was happening in Belfast. So, and also, we're looking for trained men. Don't send down any rookies, please, of which you have many. This has a local edge to it, and this is the Belfast expulsions in 1920, where mainly Catholics were put out of their employment. And this is Adelaide and Windsor locomotive maintenance and wagon works. And on the other hand, you have Mr. Glover, Mr. Hill. Glover was a Geordie from Newcastle-on-Tyne, who at that stage probably said I should have stayed in Newcastle-on-Tyne. And you can see, you can read what he's saying, that if Sinn Féin are engaged in nefarious work with whom the majority refuse to work, it is their business to inform the authorities. Now, if you go down to the end, Mr. Glover also said if any of the hotheads wished to form a delegation, he would see them, that around Dundalk certain names such as Cook and Irwin were freely mentioned as irreconcilables. Now, you see the next page, they have the views, the names, the grade, their union affiliation. Cook and Irwin, when he says to these men, in Dundalk you're being freely talked about as irreconcilables, he's not saying that you go and sue someone for defamation. He's saying, given what was going on in Ireland and in Belfast in 1920, you could well stop a bullet. Yeah. So it's getting guys to have a reality check. This is one of the people who was expelled, saying, bloody blah, to hand a wish to inform you that I accept your offer of employment at some other station. Although I would have thought that having attested my loyalty to the King and country in 1892, 1899 and again in 1914, this would have been sufficient. Now, on the other side of that coin, you have tenancy books from Dundalk Railway Station from 1922, where 6 tenancies were given up on the same day. Now, if you trace back to the 1911 census, all of them were Protestant. So that's the other side of the coin. But the big point here is that bad and all as this stuff is, where your workmates or your neighbours turn on you, at least the railway company could shuffle the pack. The people in Dundalk mainly moved to Newry and Enniskillen, and this guy here was moved to Armagh. This is the evacuation of children from Belfast in 1939. Now, most people who live on this island, their eye will instinctively run to the names of the schools and where they're going, and will immediately work out their sectarian, their religious affiliation. But you can see that's the movement order for the evacuation of Belfast. And this is what they were given. 1 pint of carton of milk, 1 ham sandwich, 2 full rounds, 1 Paris bun, 1 apple, 2 sticks of barley sugar. And a second ration to be provided for evacuees going to the following places. And these are the numbers. The LMS, the Great Northern, and the Belfast and County Down Railway. Now, we also have files. History, I have no time for counterfactual what-if history. It's a useful parlour game. But we can't ignore the things that people planned for and didn't happen. So one of the files we also have is the file for the evacuation of Dublin in the event of bombing. Because while Dublin wasn't bombed, there was one stray accident in comparison to Belfast, which was blitzed very badly twice in 1941. But people had to plan for evacuation. And in those cases, it was the evacuation of mothers, expectant mothers and children, and in trains of 1,000 each to carry sufficient loaves in the van to last for 2 days. And also in the guard's van would be sufficient flour and bread soda to bake for a further 2 days. after all that heavy stuff, I'll just give you a brief handout, which is not strictly archives, but which is from the Railway Gazette. A widely read, this is like Ian Hislop's thing, a widely read publication, and which deals with, sorry, can I just take half of them, please? Which deals with a situation in 1944, where you have the appointment by the London and North Eastern Railway of official cats. The official cats were there to combat the unofficial mice who were depredating the company's food stores. But if you go down, and I thought this was the 1st of April when I saw it first, cats were placed upon the payroll and station masters were authorised to place money on their sustenance. And the best bit is, vacancies are filled as they occur. Can you imagine interviewing a cat? Where do you see yourself in 3 years' time? In front of the fire asleep? Where do you think? So, the best bit, and they're often ignored, is the file list. Because even if the files don't survive, the file list tells you what's going on. And sometimes it can change your perception. So, for example, Ireland was convulsed by a civil war between 22 and 23. I'm nearly finished. So I got to the engineer's book of the Great Northern Railway and saw a huge amount of derailments and expected to find details of anti-treaty Republican attacks on the railway. No, the majority of derailments were attributed to the new Class D locomotives, and they were too heavy for the light track. So they can alter your perceptions. And for example, the Great Southern Western Railway in 1914, at Kingsbridge Station, Dublin, now Houston, they placed a saloon coach at the disposal of the military officers who were dealing with transport. And the saloon coach had only been there 6 weeks when a driver was brought up in charge of filching a bottle of wine. He had fairly refined tastes, more refined than the 2 shunters who were done for procuring a cask of brandy, and definitely more refined taste than the 2 soldiers who managed to lift a firkin of stout. This one is from the Great Northern Railway, and the files don't survive. And it's military files. And you can see, but this is the one that intrigues me. Jim Crow arrangements. So the Great Northern Railway, they're used to dealing with military requests. You know, the OC almost says, I want I want a train of 8 coaches to carry men to Belfast down. But with the military they would say, I want 2 trains of 4 coaches each, one for black soldiers, one for white soldiers. I would love to see if that had survived. So that's a brief look at what we have, and if there's any questions I'll do my best to answer.
Short photographic archive. First point to make about this archive, which has been now in PRONI for 2 or 3 years, it is a photographic archive. It's not the actual business archive of the company, which, well, let's just say that that archive isn't here. But they have given us their photographic archive, which is big enough to be going on with. It's an archive of somewhere, now it just occurred to me when I was getting my notes ready for this, I never actually counted them. I don't know what I've been doing all these years, but it's probably somewhere north of 100,000 photographs in it. They are 323 albums containing anything from 20 to about 200 photographs, plus a lot of loose photographs, plus all the negatives. So there's a huge archive which records the activities of this company from 1900 through to 1990s. 1989, I think it was, they were taken over by Bombardier, the Canadian Aerospace. They are still here as part of Bombardier Aerospace. They're still a major presence in Belfast. They're the largest industrial employer in Northern Ireland, probably the largest employer outside the civil service, employing over 5,000 people, and they're literally just down the road there. Some of you may have flown into the airport, which was developed alongside the aircraft factory, and just go down the road and around the corner, you will see the George building. So they are still a major player in the aviation industry. Just a wee bit of background about them. We don't have time to go through detailed history. The 3 Short brothers, that's them there, from the north of England. They in many ways very typical Victorian figures. They were involved in a lot of industrial enterprises, all sorts of little companies being set up, including bicycles. They're involved in the bicycle business. Everybody that's involved in either aviation or in motor cars in British in the early 20th century seemed to start off in bicycles, to get people an introduction to the engineering issues. So they started off doing that, but they come together from 1906, they start building balloons, or making balloons, the correct phrase. And they're doing this in London, as you see, in Battersea, right beside the gas station, the gas plant, which is where the gas is coming from. And they become the official balloon manufacturer to the British Aero Club. And that gives them a very important connections. They move from balloons seamlessly into gliders, and from gliders into powered aircraft. As you know, the first powered flight, probably, there's still some discussion about this, is the Wright brothers in 1903. And the Wright brothers actually team up with the Short brothers. Quite a famous photograph here taken in 1909. And Shorts get a contract to build the Wright Flyer under license in Britain. And that's a very interesting photograph which has the Short brothers, the Wright brothers, and a lot of very important people in the early days of British aviation, including C.S. Rolls, Brabazon is that in there, Frank McLean, quite a lot of our early pilots and pioneers. So the Short brothers are right in the middle of the birth of the aircraft industry in Britain. They claim to be the first company to actually manufacture aircraft on a production line. I'm sure that is claimed as disputed by others, but that is certainly the claim that they make. They go on to make their own designs of aircraft, and as you say, working closely with the early aviation pioneers. Quite a known one was Frank McLean. This is him flying a Short S-33 under Tower Bridge. Apparently they were irritated by the amount of publicity that the French aircraft pioneers were getting, so they thought they would show what a British aircraft and pilot could do. The British government rose to the challenge of this, responding magnificently and passed a bylaw banning aircraft from flying under Tower Bridge. This is what it is to be a pioneer of aviation. With the outbreak of the First World War, Shorts, of course, like all the aircraft manufacturers, are able to expand. And even at this stage, Shorts are specialising in seaplanes. They have a very close relationship with the Admiralty. Again, it's much disputed in the debate claim that the first ever aircraft to fly off a warship was a Shorts aircraft. So as I say, they're making aircraft for the Admiralty, but also doing other types as well, including one of the first heavy bombers, is the Short bomber. So as I say, like most of the aviation industry, they get a big boost from the First World War. They're able to expand production and experiment with new types of aircraft. Post-war, there is a contraction to a certain extent, but they continue to innovate. One of the first all-metal aircraft to be built is the Shorts Shallow in 1920. And they make a large number. I won't go repeat, I'm not going to take you through all the types that they make during the 1920s, but they do become known for their flying boats. Initially made for the RAF, we find flying boats very useful in actually controlling the extended British Empire. You could bring these planes down in very remote areas. So they do a sort of range of flying boats for the RAF. They also continue to do civil aircraft. The George Valletta, a not particularly successful aircraft done for Imperial Airways, but they are doing innovative monoplane passenger aircraft. But as I say, it is the flying boats. They then move out into civilian flying boats, and this is what they become known for, is doing these very high specification civilian flying boats which are flying across the Empire, bringing together the Empire so you can get now to Cape Town in 2 or 3 days in a flying boat, stopping off at the Great Lakes in Kenya on the way, and it's a very luxurious type of travel. That's the interior of a flying boat. I do what happens to those vases full of daffodils if you get a bit of turbulence. That in theory is what the inside of the aircraft was like. This is travelling in luxury. This is not Ryanair. This is doing it in style. And they move on from that into what they became best known for is the Empire flying boats, the C-class and G-class flying boats built for Imperial Airways, huge, very luxurious long-range aircraft. The company is based by this stage in Rochester in Kent on the lower reaches of the Thames. And that's the sort of apogee of that sort of development where they were trying, they continued to experiment and innovate, and this was an experiment getting a very high speed cross-Atlantic plane which would piggyback off a larger boat, and then when the whole contraption gets airborne, the smaller plane takes off and takes the mail at high speed over to Canada. It did actually work. They tried it a few times and then the war So they stopped experimenting. So why does it end up in Belfast? Short answer is I haven't really got to the bottom of that yet, and there's a little project which I will recommend to any of my academic colleagues here, is that nobody's really worked out why. There is some interesting correspondence in the files from among others Lord Rothermere, writing to another figure best known from the writing publics, Lord Londonderry, whose papers we also have here. So they're certainly involved. Rothermere, although he's sort of interested, is considered to be a figure off the right, he does want to develop British air power, and he does notice and does get his papers to write up the fact that most of the British aircraft industry is located in the southeast of England. So if you're attacked by an enemy from the east, if you're coming from the east, wherever that may be, you are fairly vulnerable. So he is writing and suggesting that they need to relocate part of the British aircraft industry to Northern Ireland, and pointing out Northern Ireland at Lough Foyle and Lough Neagh has good facilities for building flying boats. And this is taken up by the Northern Ireland government, so you do get these reports. Interestingly enough, though, that report there doesn't mention Shorts, it mentions a couple of other companies who might build flying boats there, but not Shorts. So we don't know why Shorts comes. Shorts does arrive in 1937. They're located at the New Harbour Airport, that's just out there, which is being developed by the Harbour Commissioners, and they is to develop the airport and the new aircraft factory together. But interestingly enough, they don't come to build flying boats initially. Then that's the Shorts building, which again is just around the corner, one of the nicer examples of 1930s architecture, and still very much in its original condition, other than the damage what the Germans did in the 1940s. But there's companies expanding hugely beyond that, but that main office block is still there, and I think a very nice example of industrial architecture from that period. What they come initially to build is that monstrosity, the Bristol Bombay, one of the least successful aircraft of the Second World War, built under contract for the Bristol Company in England. Not a great success in itself, but these do other things. Shorts initially in Belfast, they specialise in building the least fashionable planes, other things like the Henry Page Hertfords. We fixate on the aircraft that won the Battle of Britain, Spitfire and the Hurricane. You forget about the aircraft that lost the Battle of France, like the Battle and the boat called Defiant. If you haven't heard of those, don't worry, you're not missing much. But Shorts seem to be specialising in the least successful aircraft at this period. But they do want to go on to greater things, and Belfast become known for two major important aircraft of the First World War, the Stirling and the Sunderland. The Stirling was the first of the big heavy 4-engine bombers to go in production. These are the aircraft used to win the war to Germany. They are produced in large numbers, and nearly 3,000 built during the war. Over 1,000 certainly produced in Northern Ireland. That's the first one being produced. A very nice evocative picture of Stirling over the shipyard. And there's the 1,000 Stirling at McGarvey in 1944, by which stage it should be said the Stirling was more or less obsolete, but we're still trying them out anyway, such as the British aircraft industry. The other big player was a Sunderland flying boat, a development of those big passenger flying boats. The Sunderland is again a very important military aircraft in the war, over 700 built, very important in trying to keep the sea lanes to America open, flying out very long patrols over the Atlantic, many of them flying from Northern Ireland, from Manor, from the lakes there, over Donegal, out to the shipping lanes. And again, it's very interesting and very, very detailed. Make the point here, a lot of this stuff is very technical and very detailed, these photographs. But photographs showing the scale of the reduction of the Sunderlands there. A lot of people come to look at these are people who have possibly more interest in aircraft cockpit layouts than is altogether healthy. But there's a huge, if you are into that, if you're into jigs, you want to understand the machines that they actually use to make these things, there are album after album after album of this sort of photograph. Anything you ever want to know, I was over recently just trying to do a complete CAD recreation of the cockpit of a Sunderland, and he got everything he needed and more in here. So it's a huge amount. You could actually rebuild one of these, and I'm sure somebody is rebuilding on their shed on these. So it's just make that point. Some of the stuff is very, very technical, some of these photographs. There's also some other stuff. One of the other things done during the war is there's a civilian repair facility. We're actually repairing aircraft. So we do have the photographs of these iconic aircraft like the Hurricane and the Gloucester Postal Gladiator, which was the frontline fighter in 1938-39, only 3 years before. So why they were repairing that in 42, I don't know. And so I'm running out of time already. The constitution of aircraft in Belfast didn't go unnoticed. The Germans particularly have noticed it. Shorts there's a lot of stuff about shorts preparations for the war, the Home Guard and ARP, but the Germans arrived in 1941, do a huge amount of damage. Shorts then disperses into various factories. Those of you in Belfast will know that's the King's Hall. That is, some of them's being built inside the King's Hall in 1944. This was dispersal. That is the sheds up at Lonkesh, the maze, which is where the Aviation Society now is. And even very small garages are used for this dispersal. Small workshops all over the place, and the photograph is down on the wall. Beside Churchill, just a reminder that the labour relations in those days weren't always very cosy. That's one of the problems with dispersal, is you put it in pieces, and then you have to bring it in pieces to an airfield and you can fly it off. So not a good idea in rural Ulster. I suspect they built fuselage in Belfast and started to wonder how they were going to get it down to McGarver, but I can't fly it off. So there's quite a lot of photographs and trying to get loaders around roads and bridges. Huge employer. Women coming into the workforce, very important theme in this photograph, in these photographs. Lots of stuff on that, bring women into the workforce. And then after the war, they move into civilian aircraft, initially taking the same sort of types, flying boats, assuming flying boats. Flying boats, however, again, trying to recreate that luxury pre-war era. Doesn't really work. These things are unpressurized, they're not particularly comfortable on a long flight to Australia. But they are trying to sell it as the luxury option. You know, it's like a small hotel. It even has a bar. I mean, what could you go wrong? Aircraft at a bar, and I mean, you know, you could resist. And I'm running out of time, but briefly, you know, there's continuing to build aircraft during the 50s, 60s. Things like the Bristol Britannia, which is built on license over here from Bristol. Quite a lot of those are built here. The Canberra PR9, which the Ulster Aviation are rebuilding one at the minute. That's built by Shorts as well. They develop their own types, like the CMU Sperm, which is an unsuccessful one. A lot of stuff is about aircraft which don't actually make it off the books now, which is quite interesting. This was an early jet bomber which isn't taken up, which never flew. That's a Photoshop photograph, by the way. There's nothing new about that. I don't think there's anything ever left behind, actually. And they certainly didn't build two of them. But probably the most important one they built during the 60s and 70s is the Skyvan. Small light aircraft. So there's a lot of stuff about the Skyvan and the Sealand, another very important flying boat which is made in large numbers, and the Belfast Freighter, which is a scaled up Bristol, which was the Army's main large haul aircraft. In the 60s, this was the contract was going to set them on their feet. Then Harold Wilson decided to cut down the size of the Air Force. They do diversify in the 60s. They're always doing diversify beyond aircraft. One of the things was this wonderful thing. It was a mangle. If you can remember mangles, so they're doing these. But this was a special mangle because it converted them to a table that you could play. Why that didn't catch on, I do not know. They're also making vacuum cleaners and garbage sweepers and milk churn. This is a man stress testing a milk churn. And that was my favourite photograph in the whole 100,000. There's just one picture of a cow standing in the middle of the field. They also did buildings. A lot of stuff about the people that worked there. They had a very good magazine called Short Story. Rather bad pun, but a very good magazine. So there's a lot of stuff about the people that worked there. Quite a lot of photographs about that. So it's a human archive as well. Covers their expansion. And I do this just briefly. I do like this little sequence which tells you something about working conditions in the 1950s and 60s. That's the executive dining room. That's the junior staff executive dining room. That's the workers' canteen. British industry in post-war years personified, I think. There's quite a lot about the social life, the things they did for the apprentices. They move into computers in the 1960s. They're actually building their own computers at one stage. Which have to be operated by men in white coats for some reason, or by women in short skirts. There's quite a lot of that as well. If you want to study sexism and British advertising, it's quite a good archive for that. And on to later, where they're actually partnering with Boeing. That wasn't built over here, but they did build the engine pods for it. And I finish on that because I haven't a clue what it is, but it's something about advanced composites, which I don't know what they are, but To make the point, it does continue, the whole archive does cover the whole period right up to 1990s, and it is continuing concern. So I shall leave it there for people reading the report.
I do feel a bit of a fraud standing here because I know there's a lot of transport experts and historians in here. I want to make it very clear to start, I'm not. My interest in this comes from the point of view that Ian Montgomery, who you had this morning talking about shorts, we worked on the Corporation Archive together, and we did an exhibition in 2000 in which was based on the various functions of the old corporation. And the transport section of the exhibition and the health section were the only bit of the exhibition that got 2 panels, and the other functions only got 1. So I know slightly more about transport than I do about some of the other functions, but I only know 180 words worth. So I stretch that, I'm not sure. But really what I want to do is bear in mind, I come at this from a generalist point of view, an archivist point of view, a records point of view, that give you sort of an overview of the main developments that took place in transport utility that was run by the corporation. But I have to start first of all with a wee bit of history to that, because the first tramway company in Belfast was a private undertaking. In 1871, Daniel Larson and William Morris obtained permission of Parliament to have a tramway in Belfast, and that was confirmed by an Act of Parliament in August 1872. And on the 28th of August 1872, the first tramway opened in Belfast for passengers. And it was extended fairly quickly, 1873, 1878. Further powers were gained from Parliament to extend it. And at that stage, for some of you who are interested in the technical things, which mean very little to me, it also got permission to widen the gauge from 5 feet 3 to 4 feet 8.5 inches. And that was the last and only bit of technical information that I would give out. Although the company was expanding, and these further extensions had been completed by 1881, the company's finances were not in a good state. Much worry was about them. And the first manager was a man called Andrew Totten. And when he resigned, he was replaced by this gentleman here, Andrew Nance. But the financial receipts at that time were less than about £15,000, but the expenses were also about £15,000, and depending on what source you read, the profits for the year was anything from £1,400 to £400. So the financial positions weren't good, and this is what Nance faced when he came, and this is the best picture I could get of Nance. You guys may be very interested if we had a better one of him. Nance had been involved with the celebrated railway engineers. I'm told they're celebrated railway engineers, Hood and Jacob. He'd been involved in Portsmouth with tramways before he comes to Belfast. But due to his sound financial management and rigid management style, which I might touch on if I get time later on, really the financial position of the company improved, so that by 1887 receipts had gone up to 48,000 and expenses were about 30,000. So the profit the company was turning around, if my maths are right, was about £18,000. So he really did make a big difference to the viability of the private company. And as a result of that, in 1888 they got permission to extend the lines further. And in 1896 they got the first permission, in sort of anticipation of what was to come. They got the first permission of Parliament to introduce electric traction and to move from horsepower. But the company's finances still were quite difficult. And in 1899 they approached the corporation, Belfast Corporation, to invite, as the word used, the corporation to start constructing the actual tramways in the city themselves. They really didn't, the private company really didn't have the money to spend. But on top of that, under the 1872 Tramways Act, the corporation had the right to buy the firm out, to buy the company out. So they were reluctant, given their financial position, to spend any more money. They thought that in a few years' time, the corporation could buy them out. And about the same time, it begins to build in Belfast, an interest that the city should, the municipal authority, the corporation should be in charge of the entire tramway system, and that they should convert it from horse traction to electric traction. And it will come as no surprise to people who know the history of Belfast that really the driving force behind that was William James Perry, who was in charge of the shipyard across the way here. But he was also very much, as an alderman on the council, encouraging the council to develop electricity. And he was the chairman of the electricity committee that opened the first electricity generating station in the 23rd 23rd of January 1895 in Chapel Lane in the centre of Belfast. Now, if you're going to talk about electric tramways, I think you need electricity supply to do it. And so that was very much Perry. And Perry led a delegation to Dublin, because Dublin was already running electric trams, I'm led to believe. And Perry led I suppose you call it what would call it, I know some journalists would call it a junket to Dublin in today's language, to investigate what was happening in Dublin and throughout Europe, to see what they were happening in Great Britain as well as what was happening in terms of developing electricity. He was also interested in what cities were doing in terms of trams. But the outcome of a lot of this was that he persuaded the corporation that it should open the first big generating station. The one in Chapel Lane was very small. On the 18th of October 1898 they opened the first large, and some people in the audience here will remember the one in East Bridge Street, because that is what made it possible to have an electric tramway system. Now, as I touched on a moment ago, the corporation had the right to buy the private tramway company out, but it was easier talked about than done, because they had entered into an agreement in 1892, confirmed by an Act of Parliament in 1893, that they wouldn't do that for 14 years. The date being from August 1883, they wouldn't do it for a further 14 years, on condition that the company paid them £4,000 for the first 7 years and £5,000 for the second seven years. But by 1907, by shortly after they signed the agreement in 1893, particularly in the late 1890s, the corporation came to realise that there was a clamour for an improved tramway system, and that if they waited until 1907, the date of this agreement that they could purchase it at, that they would be inheriting a very out-of-date tramway system, and it would take about £500,000 to convert it to electric. So there was more and more pressure on, but there were protracted negotiations between the private company and the corporation unsuccessfully, and they went to arbitration. And the result of the arbitration in 1905 was that in total, whenever everything was added in, the corporation bought the tramway system for £371,920, 14 shillings and 7p, if you want to be exact. And I can give you a breakdown of that figure if you wish, but not now. In 1904, when they took it over, the private tramway company had 800 men, 160 trams, 1,400 horses, and total covered 9,000 miles each day, and it carried a total number of passengers of just over 29,000. So it gives you an idea of what it was. But the corporation, having paid this sum of money, taken over on the 1st of January 1905. The last day of trams, for those who are interested in the finer point of detail, was the 4th of December 1905, and this is one of the photographs from the archive that's in the corporation archive, which is held here at PRONI, under the general reference number of LA7. And it's also the beginnings of the electric era in terms of tramways in the city. 40 miles of track were relaid, 170 trams costing £585 each were purchased, and the tram drivers and conductors were trained. This is them laying some of the trams at the Royal Avenue, York Street, Donegal Street junction in 1905, and this is the little image here of the training of the first motormen, or drivers as I would call them, and conductors who were being trained in 1905. The first electric tram car to run anywhere in Belfast on the system was on Falls Road. It ran on the 26th of September 1905, but the system proper was opened on the 29th of November 1905, and this is the Lord Mayor Dixon with Mr Blackburn, who was in charge of the engineering side of things in the corporation transport section, on a tram on the 29th of October, the official opening. And this is it on the 8th of December, less formal, one of the earliest photographs of the actual electric system operating at Stranmos. But tying it back to electric, just to give you an idea, because I think sometimes I would be critical of people when they're using certain sections of council archive, when they're looking at particular sections within what the corporation did. They tend to look at the one section and not see what was happening in corresponding functions across the council. And if you're looking at trams, you also need to look at the records to do with electricity, because in 1907 the tramway utility was using 7.5 million units of the 10.5 million units sold by the corporation. So the transport were the electricity utility's main customer, and their main customer by a very considerable way. Nance, who I mentioned earlier, he came across with the private company. Andrew Nance, he comes across, even before the corporation actually owned the company, he's attending corporation committee meetings, giving advice, and he comes across with it. And He really was the driving force behind the whole preparations for the electric system. This is a photograph of the main depot in Sandy Row, where you can see the tracks being laid into the engineering works at Sandy Row. Just look here how close the houses are across the way from it. And this, and the people, and here's just a shot of inside the engineering workshop. So that's where a lot of the hard graft was done. Not only did they buy, the only trams they bought were at the start of the system, but Nance also took 50 of the best horse trams and converted them. Now the trams that they bought under contract, the electric trams they bought under contract were £585. Nance took 50 of the best horse trams and he converted them for a sum of £470 each, which really was a saving of about £5,000 across the system for the 50 trams that he did himself. It's Nance's influence, and I really love somebody to look at Nance. Nance's influence on the early company is quite significant. Can't mention Nance without mentioning Cave Hill and Whitewell tramway. This was a separate tramway from the private Belfast Street tramways or the corporation tramway initially. It opened in 1882. Very famous date in Ulster history, on the 1st of July, but it happened to be 1882, not 1916. It ran from Chichester Park Gate on the Antrim Road, which was the end of the corporation of the street tramways terminus, to Glendormley in North Belfast, for those of you who are not familiar with the city. It was originally steam when it opened, and then in 1891 it was a mixture of horse and steam traction, and then in 1895 it did away with steam completely and was only horse. And then in 1902 it was transferred to electric, and it opened, or we got permission to transfer to electric, and it opened as electric in 1906. Nance was a man of very strong opinions. No matter what you read about him, you see a very strong personality, strong opinions. He was initially opposed to the purchase of this scheme, but whenever it was proposed that rather than purchase it, that would go on a 50-year lease to the corporation, he very quickly changed his mind and was in favour of purchasing it. But the significance, I suppose, in the history of the city is that when they bought this system, which they bought for £56,115, they also inherited 32 acres of land with the name of Drumnadraw, which they quickly changed to Bellevue because it sounded much more posh. It was and easier to pronounce. That is now where the zoo is. It's very rough ground, very steep ground. And Nance is really opened first as a park, and Nance again was the man who had the vision that that piece of ground should be used in that way. Nance retires in 1916, and the final section of the systems is built under a manager called J.S.D. Moffat, who replaced Nance in 1916. And the final piece of tramway to be laid in Belfast is laid in that period between 1921 and 1926. There's none laid thereafter. And by the end of the 20s, the corporation's tramway system was 102 miles long, carrying 104 million passengers a year, and they had 341 tram cars. But by that time, the corporation had started cautiously to introduce another form of public transport, and that being buses. Under the 1904 Corporation Tramways Act, they had permission from Parliament to run omnibuses moved by either animal or mechanical power, to use the words in the Act, for the purposes of supporting the tramway system. Now, by 1920, the corporation didn't really know what those powers entitled them to do, but they went and there were proposals to further extend the tramway system, but really it was felt that they needed to look at something different. And Moffat took a report to the Committee of Councillors, the Tramway Committee, on the 13th of October 1920, where he really argues the case for the purchase of the first buses. So basically he's saying the most valuable, I quote, the most valuable feature of the motor bus as an auxiliary vehicle in a tramway system is its self-propelled property or faculty of mobility, which enables it to be transferred from route to route or point to point by the shortest cut. He also made on to make the point that you could try and experiment with routes without the financial risk of building a tramway. And he goes on to make that point. And the corporation clarifies its powers, and by 1924 has full powers to run an omnibus, or buses as I call them. Now what they need to point out at this stage is that up until then Belfast had a monopoly over public transport in the city. They were the licensing authority for public service vehicles in the city. So what that meant was that if anybody wanted to open a bus system, they had to apply to the corporation for permission, and to protect their monopoly, as you would expect, they would refuse. But gradually buses from the country areas were coming into Belfast, and against the law, they were picking people up inside the city boundary and dropping people within the city boundary, and this caused a lot of ill feeling. But the corporation itself purchased its first buses in 1925, and it opened its first service on the 4th of October 1926, the first route being from the City Hall to the Cave Hill Road, and then very quickly after that it opened one from the gasworks to Agnes Street. But even by mid-1928 they still only had 8 buses. And it's very clear that a lot of people in the corporation still felt that the buses were only to supplement the tramway system. They hadn't quite lost hope in the tramway system, even though they weren't building any more lines. But I think what really starts to change things is what we call the Belfast Bus War, or what this historian, who the book I would recommend to everyone at PRONI still have copies of it, by Eugene Greer, E.E. Greer, called Roads and Rail, which documents a lot of what I'm going to say in a moment, was the passing of the 1926 Motor Vehicles Act of Northern Ireland, which took away from the corporation the monopoly, which meant that other people could operate transport in the city, and moved the power of licensing from the corporation to the Minister for Home Affairs here in Northern Ireland. The council were in a position they could introduce bylaws to get some of their powers back, but we'll come to that just in a little minute. But initially the private companies didn't really catch on to what this lucrative business opportunity was, but at the beginning of June 1928, 2 of the big bus companies, and some of you will be familiar with these names, particularly Callawoods and the Belfast Omnibus Company, they started running services from Glengormley and Dundonald into Belfast, and they were very, very successful. And really that's the period that it intensifies the competition between the private bus companies and the corporation's transport company. The corporation describes as very serious, unrestricted and controlled competition from the bus operators. So they get a clear feeling of what the corporation felt about it. And by August 1928, from June to August 1928, there's 140 buses, private bus companies operating in the city, and the corporation's undertaking in terms of their receipts are down by £3,000 to £4,000 a week. So they're suffering heavily. There was a lot of ill feeling. Like, you had the private bus companies driving across, obstructing trams. You had the corporation reducing fares. So what the private company did, they did the same thing. They reduced fares. But I think probably the biggest threat of all was the corporation transport manager decided that if you came to the zoo in a private bus, you weren't getting in. He didn't act upon it. It was only a suggestion. But anyway, the corporation did present very strict bylaws in late summer of 1928 to get back some of its licensing powers. The Minister of Home Affairs weren't happy, the bus companies weren't happy. They held an inquiry, and behind the inquiry there were some secret negotiations going on, led by Mr. William Chamberlain, who was the transport manager of the corporation. And they reached an agreement whereby the private operators agreed to withdraw their bus services from Belfast, give the corporation back its monopoly. The corporation would buy 50 of the buses and would either run them themselves, or in some cases they let the private operators operate them under an agreement with the council. And that resolved the bus war, and by that stage then obviously the corporation has 58 buses. They were now fully aware of the potential of the buses, and they ran their first corporation double-decker buses from December 1930. This is not the first one. The first one, I believe, was number 60, but the number 63 is the first I could get a picture of. So really that, they had realised, I think, that the tramways were not going to have it all their old way, and they weren't going to be able to resist the competition from buses. By that time there's a huge debate going on in the corporation, which at that time is now, from 1931 to 1951, is led by the legendary Transport General Manager Robert McCreary. Huge debate going on, although there'd been no clear policy initially. Like in 1930 the corporation had bought 50 new tram cars, okay? But other people were arguing you should open buses. On the other hand, you had people saying that it must be buses, because there's been no new tramway routes built since 1925. You have all these debates back and forward. But really by that stage, another form of transport, trolley buses, were really starting to appear on the agenda of the council. And in October 1936, the corporation decided to introduce an experimental trolley bus. Again, the Falls Road was selected as the route for the first trial of the trolley bus, same place where the first trials of the trams had taken place. And on the 28th of March, the Lord Mayor of Belfast, Sir Robert McCullough, opened the trolley bus operation to be a great success. Now, in January 1939, the corporation took a decision to replace trams by trolley buses as the principal form of transport in the city, but again supplemented by buses. And not unsurprisingly, given that they were operating a mixed fleet, they actually changed their name from the Tramways Committee to the Transport Committee. To switch the system to trolley buses, it was felt it would cost £1,750,000, and that the whole thing would be completed between 1939 and 1944. But of course, as we know, the Second World War was to intervene, which delayed everything. And sorry, that's a picture of a trolley bus at Dundonald Terminus in 1942. And the last tram actually ran on the 27th of February 1954. It was a celebratory run where the 12 remaining tram cars left Queen's Road on one last journey across the city to Ardoyne Depot, led by the Lord Mayor, Sir Percival Brown, at that time. In terms of the trolley buses, I suppose 1954 also marks the peak of the size of the trolley bus fleet in Belfast. They had 245 trolley buses, just coincidentally the 382 buses at that time. But their trolley bus fleet was the largest fleet in the United Kingdom outside London. But very quickly in August 1959, the General Manager, Joseph Mackle, recommended to the Council that trolley buses be replaced by buses. And this was adopted by the full Council. And in the early 1960s, the switch over from closing down trolley bus lines to buses moves, I wouldn't say a pace, it took quite a long time because the final trolley bus system wasn't closed until Sunday the 12th of May 1968, the day before, again in a repeat of what they'd done with the trams. They ran a special journey down the Falls Road with, again, the Lord Mayor at the time leading this procession, sort of nearly a duplication of what they had done with the trams. By that stage then, the corporation is only running buses, and this is a bus in the bad snow of 1963, as most people refer to it. But even by that stage, the end of the Belfast Corporation Transport undertaking is open to doubt. Passenger numbers had been going down since the Second World War. There's a lot of reasons for that I won't go into here, but I think what really marked the end for the corporation transport undertaking was the outbreak of civil disorder known locally as the Troubles in late 1969. Between 69 and early 71, there was something like 62 buses totally destroyed. And the corporation were just about to stand against that sort of loss out of their own financial reserves. But following the introduction of internment, I can't remember if it was August 71 or August 72, the amount of civil disorder increases enormously, and the loss to buses increases enormously. And the corporation didn't have the money to pay for it without taking money from the city rate fund, but they weren't allowed to take money from the city rate fund. You had to apply to the Northern Ireland government. So they went to the Ministry of Development looking for a handout essentially, and the price of the handout, they got 750,000. The price of the handout from the Ministry of Development was that they would go into talks with Ulsterbus about coordinating services, particularly in the Greater Belfast area. But in 1973, the whole Belfast Corporation transport undertaking is, one word they used is merger, but essentially it's a takeover by Ulsterbus, which we traded initially under the name of City Bus. It's now Metro, and Ulsterbus, I suppose, now is referred to as Translink. But really, in 1973, the corporation ceased to own or operate its own road passenger transport system, having had it since 1905, and that to me sounds like a good place for me to end. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Brian Patterson's the name, and I'm actually one of the trustees of the SS Pneumatic. And the pneumatic charitable trusts were set up in 1908 when pneumatic was brought back in Belfast. Sorry, 2008. And we were basically set up to oversee the restoration of pneumatic. Now, I'm really going to go in reverse here because I know you're all going on to pneumatic later on, and I don't want to steal their thunder. But I'm going to give you a few minutes about pneumatic, and of course, she was what I call the little sister of Titanic, both built by the White Star Line, and the White Star and the pneumatic is the only remaining White Star Line vessel in the world. And of course, we know that Titanic was built in Harland Wolff, which is part of Belfast, as you know. So I'm just going to do give you a few minutes of all these, the importance of all these things. Now, I'm actually an architect by profession, and all this stuff is really a hobby to me. So, I'm a total fanatic about it all. But it'll only be a few minutes about each of the subjects. Firstly, I'll talk about Belfast. Now, Belfast 1912, which is the year of Titanic. Belfast was the most successful industrialised city in the world in 1912. She had the largest tobacco works in the world, which was Yorkgate, which is over that direction if any of you are familiar with Belfast. She had the largest rope works in the world, which was out of Connswater, and it was actually founded by Gustav Wolff of Harland Wolff fame. She had the largest fizzy drinks company in the world, and this was before Coca-Cola, and that was Cantor and Cochrane, which is still in existence. That was up Castlereagh. She had the largest linen mills in the world. Now, they were run by the Clark family, who still live out in the Upperlands near Coleraine, and also the Andrews family, who are out in Cumber. And of course, Thomas Andrews was very much involved in Titanic and the White Star Line. Belfast also had the largest shipyard in the world, which was Harland Wolff. She also had the second largest shipyard in the world, Workman Clark. Now, these sound great facts and figures, but just remember one thing. With the exception of flax, everything was imported. So what does that say to you about Belfast? She must have had the best managers and the best businessmen in the world. Two of whom would have been Harland and Wolff, and later on Lord Pearley, who was very much responsible for Titanic. But they also had the best workers in the world. And just when you leave here, just think about that, because it's something that's very, very, very important. Right, now I'll move on to Harland and Wolff, and as I just mentioned there under Belfast, Harland and Wolff were the largest shipyard in the world. They built the largest and most luxurious ships. And I'll talk about the most famous one, Titanic, in a couple of minutes. Harland and Wolff were founded by a Scotsman, William Ritchie, in 1861. And let's forget about the 1912 period of Titanic, but over that period, up to very recently, when they don't build ships anymore as much as they do the oil rigs, and they've gone into much more modern manufacturing, such as wind farms in the North Sea, because in fact one of the greatest contracts they have now at the moment are for the Danish electricity company, and they build all the wind turbines for the North Sea. And the odd Sunday night, I live in Belfast, the odd Sunday night you see 4 or 5 wind turbines going out. And so it's a fascinating thought. But I've also talked to people who were here during the war, and they say you used to see 4, 6, 8 ships a week go out of Harland and Wolff during the war. Whether they were being manufactured or whether they were in for repair, I don't know. But some of the more famous ships that were built here were the Ark Royal, HMS Eagle, and of course the Canberra is probably the most famous as it was the most recent. And some of you may be young enough or old enough to remember A²SN. Now A²SN was a three-legged oil rig which was built at the start of oil drilling. And it actually went out worldwide to tender. And the Japanese actually came back and said, you can't build that. Well, Harland and Wolff did build it. And how you build a three-legged structure on two slipways, I don't know, but Harland and Wolff proved the Japanese wrong. So those were some of the famous ships that were built. Now, Harland and Wolff were also unique as in the fact that they numbered all their ships and then they named them. So Titanic was 401, as many of you may know, just for interest. Now, some of us in Belfast, some people in Belfast think we boast a wee bit too much about Harland and Wolff and were they that great shipyard? Well, I in fact, some years ago, 12 years ago, actually did some fitting out work on one of the Princess Cruises ships out in Italy. It unfortunately was built in Italy at a shipyard called Fincantieri up in Monfalcone, which is up in the Adriatic coast near Venice. And it's very, very interesting that I went down to the shipyard one day and they have one of these Goliath cranes. As you know, we've got two great yellow Goliath cranes called Samson Goliath. Well, they had one of these, but it's only dark grey, whereas ours is bright yellow and they're well known. Now, these have a maximum loading of about 1,000 tons. Now, I was actually down in the dock looking, and it says maximum loading 500 tons. And two of the Italian shipyard workers actually came down to me and said, oh, you look very interested. I said, yes, we have two of these back in Belfast, but they're each twice as big as this. And these two Italian ships, now remember, I don't speak any Italian. They spoke a little bit of English. They said, you come from Belfast? You know Harland and Wolff? And I said, well, I know Harland and Wolff. I don't work there, but I know of them. And they said, oh, why are you so interested in these cranes? I said, well, Harland and Wolff have got two cranes like this, but they actually each lift twice of what these lift. And they just stopped in silence. And they looked at me and they said, Harland and Wolff? Let us tell you this. As you know, in Italy, we build Fiats. Well, in this shipyard, we build the Fiat equivalent of ships. Well, let me tell you, Harland and Wolff built the Rolls Royces of ships. So that's the reputation that Harland and Wolff have around the shipbuilding world, and I think it's testament to Harland and Wolff. So that's that. Now, I'm not going to go on about Titanic too much, because I'm sure you've all seen the Hollywood blockbuster and everything else. Now, it is because of Titanic, and I'm actually a trustee on Pneumatic. It goes back many years. I'm on the Belfast Titanic Society committee. And when the trustees were set up for Pneumatic, they named someone from the World Ship Society, people from community, some MLAs, some councillors, and they also nominated someone from the Belfast Titanic Society to advise them. So that's where I came in. Now, you know that Titanic was the largest ship in the world in 1912. She was the second of three, the Olympic being the sister ship. And it was to serve the transatlantic transport. And it was to be the most extravagant and opulent ship ever. Now this was done, it was not done for speed, it was done to compete against the Cunard Line, who were the leaders at that time, and Lord Peary, the chairman of Harland and Wolff, and Bruce Ismay, they maintained that the only way to beat Cunard was to build the biggest, the best, the most opulent, the most modern, but it wasn't the fastest, despite what you may hear on the television and in the films. Now, you all know the story of Titanic. Its fame has made the word Titanic part of the English dictionary, and a recent worldwide survey recently carried out found the most recognisable words known to man are God, Coca-Cola and Titanic. Over 3,600 books have been written about her, 15 films have been made, there's musicals have been produced, etc, 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 etc. So, we know how famous Titanic is. Now, when they built her, she was 50% larger than any other ship in the world. When I'm talking about Titanic, I also mean Olympic, her sister ship. Now, it was fine because she was built here, she left Southampton to go over to America, but she then had to go to Cherbourg on the north coast of France, because Cherbourg was the in-port in mainland Europe. And they had trains and everything else coming to Cherbourg. But they suddenly realised Titanic and Olympic were so large. Well, they have been 50% larger, as I say. That Lord Peary, the chairman of Ireland, he had actually rebuilt the two slipways in Belfast, which are beyond Titanic Belfast that you see out there. They then had rebuilt the Thompson dock, which is further down. It was the largest dock, a dry dock in the world. But my goodness me, we've suddenly got Cherbourg. And Cherbourg, it couldn't take Titanic and Olympic. So they had to build a tender, or basically a mini ship. And this is where pneumatic comes in. Now, Titanic and Olympic, as I say, they were built on slipways 2 and 3, which is beyond Titanic Belfast out there. And pneumatic was built to ferry first and second class passenger go out of Cherbourg onto Titanic and Olympic. Now, White Star Line, they were so posh and everything else, as far as they were concerned, your transatlantic experience started when you stepped off at Cherbourg. So, when you were stepping onto the tender ship, it had to be Titanic, a mini Titanic effectively. So all the, I know you're going on later on, and you'll see this, all the mouldings are a copy of what's on Titanic, the light fittings, the pattern on the doors, the pattern on the floors, everything. So it's like a mini Titanic. So this is her that's the importance of her in maritime history. She is a mini Titanic. And when she was being built, if you look, when you're standing on pneumatic, you will look over, and beyond the Titanic Belfast building, on the left-hand side is slipway number 3, right-hand side is slipway number 2, and then right of that again is slipway number 1. The Titanic was built in slipway number 3, Olympic in slipway number 2, and pneumatic slipway number 1. All around the same time, between 1910 to 1912. Now the important thing to remember is, when the guys turned up in the morning to work, they didn't know what ship they were going to be working on. It could be pneumatic, it could be Titanic, it could be Olympic. So we do know pneumatic, where you'll be going later on. The guys who built it also built Titanic. The drawings were very similar, the detailing was very similar. The steel came from the same supplier, the rivets were made in the same place, the joiners who did all the carvings, they were the same joiners and the same carpenters and the same plumbers, etc, etc, etc. So, as I say, that's the importance of pneumatic. The same drawings were used, the same details, the same suppliers, the same men worked on it, and certainly as a trustee in the charitable trust, we see it as a mini Titanic. She's the only remaining White Star Line vessel, and that's her importance to maritime history. Now, I'm going to close with just, and I'm sorry I don't have a slide of this, but this is my favourite photograph, and you'll see you may have seen many of these around. Unfortunately, I do have a larger one, but I left it at home today. It's my favourite is sitting in the living room. Now, when you go down to pneumatic today, you'll be looking down Queen's Road, and here's one of your trams, by the way.
Advertising English break.
Now, we know this is 1911. Now, the reason we know it is, if you're looking down Queen's Road, this is where the Titanic Belfast building is now. This is what I was saying. This is slipway number 3. Titanic's still there. And Olympic has been launched. And something I forgot to say was, the fascinating thing is that Titanic left Belfast on the 2nd of April 1912. She was actually launched on the 31st of May 1911. Launched. Olympic actually left Belfast on the 31st of May 1911, followed by the pneumatic, which only took first and second class passengers. There was then a smaller one called the Traffic, which did third class passengers and the Royal Mail. So that day, this is the way Lord Peary, the chairman of Horn Move, did think. He thinks, great. He loved to boast. So we had Titanic was launched, Olympic, which was his favourite ship, left Belfast, Pneumatic left Belfast, Titanic left Belfast, but it was also his birthday and his wife's birthday. That's the way he did things. So, why this is my favourite, and this is why I tell you, this is 1911, is, as I say, Titanic has not yet been launched, so this is before May 1911. Olympic has been launched. So this is the Titanic building. That's the Arrow Gantry where it was built. That red building at the moment, it's still in existence out there. And this is pneumatic here. Just here in Hamilton Dock, where you'll go down this evening at 5 o'clock, I understand. So I'm not going to say anything else about pneumatic, but that, I say, that's a very, very important picture. We've got Titanic, we've got pneumatic. It's the only photograph of them together. She's Titanic's little sister, and as I say, you'll hear more about her today. And with that, I will say no more.
And now for something completely different, as the last speaker suggested. This was going to be an attempt to sort of give you a big picture, an overview, if you like, of how we might draw together some of the many different ways of understanding the past and using archives and artefacts, museums and collections that we've heard today into sort of an overall understanding of how we might use that history in order to address some of the real challenges I think we face today about the future of mobility, how we move ourselves around in a globalised world, to slip already into cliche, where the problem of environmental resources, particularly carbon emissions, and I suppose I'm going to use carbon and greenhouse gas emissions as a shortcut or a term to capture all the challenges we face in today's world to do with the environment. How we can use history, bring history to bear, a particular way of writing history, which I call, as written about elsewhere, which I call the usable past, to help us to understand the kind of predicaments that we find ourselves in today, and perhaps even to help us to think a bit more clearly about the kind of future or futures we might have when it comes to moving ourselves around. But I do want to underline the point that the last speaker made, which is I'm not suggesting that we can just look back into history and come up with nice easy lessons that will enable us to sort of open the textbook and read off a series of solutions to these very, very difficult, perhaps even intractable problems or challenges or choices we have to make about movement in the future. But I do think that even if history is not a cast iron guide to the future, because the world in which we live is an open world, it's a complex world, it's one which is inherently unpredictable. I do think that by looking back into the past, that we can see how various combinations of social, economic, cultural and political power, all operating under very specific historical conditions, have shaped the choices or shaped choices in the past about the ways in which people in the past moved around, but how they have sort of mushroomed and continued and evolved over quite a long period of time, certainly over decades, and have helped shape today's highly mobile lifestyles, in which, for example, we don't think anything, or many people don't think anything about hopping onto a so-called cheap flight and flying from Belfast to the other side of Europe, say, to go to a stag night or whatever it is. We seem to live in a world in which, for many people, mobility or personal transport, whatever you want to call it, is something akin to a right. If I got the money to pay the fare, and that fare we hope, or they hope, is always going downwards, that's something I have a right to do, no matter what the cost in terms of, broadly speaking, the environment. So I think looking to the past can help us to understand how we've reached that sort of situation where some people, perhaps even the majority of people in rich societies like Northern Ireland, UK, Europe, the rich global north, where we seem to think that we should be able, we have the right to move around as much as we want. I also think that, though, that looking back into the past can be salutary, because it can remind us that actually things can change, and can change very rapidly. I mean, again, just to use another local example, if we went back 30, 35 years, which is not that long in terms of the historical perspective, I mean, who would have predicted that most travel between Belfast and Britain, for example, would be done by aeroplane and not be done by what I think of the classic combination of ferry or even car and the short sea crossing to Stranraer or wherever. Very few people, I think, and yet here we are today. Most people travelling between Belfast and Northern Ireland, I think, will fly. So I think looking back into the past can underline the fact that actually ultimately flux is the ultimate reality. And if I can call that a lesson from the past, looking into the future, it suggests that we'd be very foolish, I think, to assume that we shall always be able to move ourselves from Belfast to the other side of Europe or whatever it is, whenever we want to. And I think too that looking back into the past can help us understand how various people and institutions have shaped today's ways of moving. And once we've got that information, perhaps we have the kind of knowledge which would enable us to think a little bit more widely about the kinds of possibilities that might open up in the future. So I want to develop this argument a little bit this afternoon. I said I was going to try to present you with a big picture. I think now, because time is a little pressing, it's going to be a sort of a big sketch. I'm just going to gesture towards some of the ideas that you can read about elsewhere if you're interested in this. And I want to focus very much on something that I've already talked about before, this idea that, you know, people are used to now just hopping on an aeroplane, going wherever they want to. And if you want to give this a slightly fancy name, which I do, and so do people, academics who work in transport studies, you could call it discretionary mobility. It's travel which in some sense, and there's a bit of a problem here, but in some sense we do choose to undertake rather than having to do so. So it's the sort of thing like going away for the weekend, perhaps, in contrast to commuting to work. That's the kind of travel that I'm talking about here, discretionary mobility. Now, some of my colleagues in transport studies have argued, and indeed demonstrated through empirical studies, that today, in the early 21st century, many people's choices about whether or not to travel and how to travel are shaped by very deep-set attitudes and expectations that are not always very obvious, even to them themselves, and nor are they attitudes that are very amenable to traditional levers of behavioural change, such as pricing. So you can put up the price of a ticket, and people will still fly until you put the price up very, very, very high. Because, you know, because there is this deep-set expectation, this historically grounded expectation that flying is a good thing, that it opens up all sorts of opportunities that can't be satisfied in any other way. So what I'm suggesting here is that there's a sort of a historically rooted everyday culture, where I'm not using the word culture here in terms of, you know, paintings and opera and high art and so on, but in a much broader sense, in which culture refers to the total of the inherited ideas, beliefs, values and knowledge which constitute the shared basis of social action. So there's a kind of everyday culture in which for many people in the rich global north there is an expectation that we should be able to travel as and when we want. And what my argument is that if we are going to develop a usable past, take on history which enables us to understand how we might shift that culture in the future, which I think we do if we are not going to wreck the globe, or wreck the world in environmental terms, then we really do also have to look back into the past and develop what I call a cultural history of transport. In other words, a history of transport that looks at, that studies the way in which these everyday attitudes towards discretionary mobility have both changed and stayed the same. Now, I think a strong case can be made to suggest that today we are actually the heirs to the kinds of beliefs that were expressed by the Victorian historian T.B. Macaulay, who, as you can read for yourselves here, claimed in 1849 that every improvement of the means of locomotion benefits mankind morally and intellectually as well as materially. That was Macaulay in 1849. If you read almost anything that comes out of the Department for Transport now, I've been doing this fairly recently for a paper I'm still writing on the lessons of history, big scare quotes for business case for high-speed rail in the UK, or as the example I've got here, which is taken from the DFT's paper on aviation a few years ago. That's Ruth Kelly. I don't know how many of you remember her as one of the many ministers of transport, so the Secretary of State for Transport we've had in the last, since the Second World War. you get the same kind of attitude coming through. I think the comparison between this quote here about the benefits of aviation and Macaulay is quite clear. Here you see the idea that mobility, discretionary mobility in the form of leisure travel important to people's quality of life is a good thing with a capital G and a capital T. For all that, yes, you know, we have to accept that there are some problematic side effects, but you know, let's deal with those, and it's good to move around. So I've been arguing that this idea that mobility is a good thing is something that is very firmly embedded in the UK, in many cultures in the rich global north. I've suggested that we can go back at least to the early Victorian period, really, the mid-19th century. It's easy to find similar kinds of attitudes. I suspect that we can go back even further than that and find similar attitudes towards mobility. But I think as we go back into the 18th century and earlier, it all gets a bit vaguer. I think actually, if we're looking for research, which really needs doing, research on attitudes towards mobility well, really, I think we need to go back to the Middle Ages to understand the tradition, the shift from the kind of society which was really rather static, feudal society, where everybody had their place in the social hierarchy, and that was mirrored by the fact that very few people moved any distance at all from the place where they lived and they worked, to the kind of society we have today, the sort of hypermobile society, as some sociologists have called it, of globalized post-modernity. And what I'd love to see, I'd love to write it myself, and maybe now I'll have the time to do so, is to write a sort of history of the longue durée, a history looking back several centuries, in which we can trace the evolution, and again we're coming back to one of the themes of the last paper, trace the evolution of attitudes which are absolutely critical to understanding our position today, and therefore to understanding the future discretionary mobility. Let's go back several centuries, see where those attitudes come from, see how and why it is that they've been maintained, how they've mutated, how they've been transformed. I mean, I suggest, for example, that we really do have to go back to feudal society, to the Middle Ages, and understand the central importance of the development of freedom of movement, which is captured, for example, in the medieval rights of passageway along highways, and how that connected in the transition from feudal society to early modern society with the notion of political freedom and economic freedom, freedom to trade, so on and so forth. So transport, which seems on the surface to be sort of very mundane, very sort of functional kind of aspect of society and the economy, becomes caught up in all sorts of very, very interesting ways back in this transition from static feudal society to early modern society with political rights, with economic rights. And I think actually that those kinds of centuries-old connections are still there today in many of the attitudes that we've been talking about in terms of our belief, or belief in many people, in the freedom to move. So what I love to develop is a sort of genealogy of transport cultures, as I call them, going back at least as far as feudal society, and tracing how our attitudes towards freedom of movement has changed and has stayed the same, all the way into the kind of era where, as a historian, I do my research, capitalism, the 19th century, the 20th century in particular, where discretionary mobility, the idea that we can just hop on a plane, becomes very much an act of consumption in a market economy. If you've got the money, you have the right to spend that money on transport, and that really is the only consideration. And I think transport historians have an awful lot to contribute to this longue durée history of cultural attitudes towards discretionary mobility. I mean, particularly as we move into the 19th century and transport becomes increasingly mechanised and increasingly capital intensive, we can begin to see how technology became a crucial factor in the maintenance and the remaking of attitudes towards personal mobility. So, you know, all that great stuff that we've been hearing today about trams, trolley buses, waterways and so on, is all part, I think, of this big picture history which I'd love to see developed in the years to come. And in particular, I think we can include studies of individual modes of transport in a big picture that links people's attitudes towards mobility, towards personal transport, to how they actually moved around in practice. Well, how might this kind of a history contribute to a usable past, as I've been calling it, which is orientated towards the mobility choices that we have in the early 21st century? How can we actually really engage, address the sorts of audiences that most of us in this room are interested in engaging? People who watch the television, people who read newspapers, people who go to museums, people who read popular histories. Well, in my 19, nearly 20 years experience working in or having strong connections with museums, in my case mostly the National Railway Museum, although I've worked with many other museums as well, it's my experience, I imagine this is shared by most of you, that most people who don't have a passionate interest in the history of transport per se, on the whole, they're interested in personalised stories about travel. So I think the kind of history that we should be researching, writing and using in order to engage the general public should focus very much on users. How might I have travelled in the past? What vehicles did people use? What was it like to travel in that kind of vehicle? What effect did travelling on the tram or a trolley bus have on the way that people lived and experienced life? And if we can get people interested in these kind of stories, which I think museums like Cultural down the road do very successfully, then I think it's not too big a step to suggest that in our exhibitions, in our media presentations, in our op-ed pieces and so on, we can begin to suggest connections between how people move today and how they used to move in the past. And this might be a stepping off point for just getting people to think a little bit more deeply about how we might move in the future. Why don't we move like that now? Why do we still move like that now? Could we go back to earlier ways of travelling, or is that a completely lost world? What would be the pluses and minuses of doing so? And I think another important way in which history is a resource, not, as I said before, history is not somewhere where you can just take a lesson and apply it to the future, or the past, the present, and the future. But you can go back into history and not do counterfactual history, I take that warning as well, but you can look at alternative paths that weren't taken. And then you can think a little bit about whether that option that wasn't taken in 100 years ago might actually, under the different circumstances of the present day, have different possibilities, have more possibilities, have more chance of success. I think, for example, the history of the electric vehicle is one area where understanding what happened about 100 years ago does have, scare quotes, lessons for the way in which the electric vehicle might or might not become one answer to urban mobility in the present. I think too that looking at technology, the vehicles and so on that we use to move around is quite important, because I think there's a very powerful myth, if I can call it that today, which is often used, I think, to excuse, if I can use slightly loaded language, to excuse what might otherwise be deemed rather unacceptable forms of travel. Driving an SUV in the city, or perhaps going across Europe to go to stag-nighting Prague or
after 4:15 p.m.
The idea of technical progress, or technological progress, call it what you will, is a powerful myth, I think, in today's society, because it tends to suggest that we don't really have to worry too much about the environmental downsides, in particular, of discretionary mobility or leisure travel, whatever you want to call it, because sooner or later, and then the expectation it will be sooner rather than later, technology will come along and will sort of clean up our acts. And this idea that better technology will reduce pollution, so on and so on and so forth, is a very, very powerful story, and it's one which, perhaps not surprisingly, is exploited very heavily by vehicle manufacturers, plane manufacturers, as you can see in this advert, who are basically saying, relax, you can continue to live your hypermobile or highly mobile lifestyles because we are going to deliver the clever technology that will enable you to do that without wrecking the planet. Now, don't misunderstand me. There is a lot of clever engineering out there. It is clever, and on the whole, the number of kilometres that we can travel per gram of CO2 emitted has been going up. You know, vehicles are becoming more efficient. That's good news. But the problem is that if we look at the way in which we kind of use that potential benefit, we're living in a world where on the whole, we don't use that better technology in order to reduce the total volume of CO2 that we're emitting. We use it to travel even further and even more times than we did before. So the crucial total volume of greenhouse gas emissions, well, in Europe it's sort of stabilised over the last 2 or 3 years, but that's probably because the economies have all slowed down. And certainly if you take the longer term trend over, say, the last 10 years, the graph unfortunately is still going like that. So I don't want to dismiss the clever engineering, but I want to make it clear that a story that says technology has always got better, has always got more efficient, and because it has done so in the past, will continue to do so in the future, is highly problematic if we want to live in a world that is not being wrecked by excessive greenhouse emissions. Well, that's the kind of the conceptual, the theoretical bit of my talk, to again refer to the last paper. I want to move on now to an example of how this might actually be developed in a rather more practical way to develop, well, in this case, it's not even an exhibition, a kind of virtual exhibition, to engage real people who are visiting real museums. I want to talk about a project which I led between 2008 between 2012. There's the team. We were part of the Institute of Railway Studies and Transport History in York. We did most of our work at the National Railway Museum. And the project was looking at how and why in Great Britain from the 1870s to the present day, well, actually till the 1970s, the railway companies in Britain encouraged leisure travel. Now, our core argument was that as commercial operators, the railways were pioneers in encouraging large numbers of people to travel when actually those people didn't need to do so. And more particularly, we argued that British railway companies marketed travel as a desirable form of consumption. In other words, they turned transport undertaken using sort of mundane everyday objects such as passenger coaches and built environments such as stations into a kind of mobility that was more than strictly getting from A to B. It was about going to enjoying yourselves, it was about form of social distinction, so on and so forth. And the project, even more specifically, tried to understand the role of businesses, the railway companies, in shaping and reshaping consumers, users, passengers' attitudes towards transport, shaping a culture of transport, cultural mobility, in which going on the train, almost for the hell of it, became something that was seen as desirable. Now, if you go back to the 1870s, I think that you can trace quite a nice line back from sort of today's culture of international binge flying, using our old favourite Ryanair and others here. I do use this poster in other countries, by the way, so I'm not having to go at Ryanair per se. All the way back to the 1870s, when the Midland Railway in Britain lowered prices to encourage, and as it turned out, not only encourage more travel, but a more socially inclusive form of travel. And as Douglas Knoop, an academic economist, put it in 1913, and this is where the title of my paper comes from, the policy of reducing fares, you probably can't read it, was, quote, to induce people who would otherwise not do so, that's the important bit, who would otherwise not do so, to travel by rail, and to encourage such as would travel a little to travel more. Absolutely clear there. It's about getting people to move. Why? Well, because the railway companies were businesses. They wanted to make money, and they thought they could do so, not surprisingly, by getting more people to travel. In fact, we can also go back 100 years or so and discover that many of the marketing techniques, which we think of as being relatively modern, like market segmentation, were there certainly in the early 20th, and arguably in the late 19th century. So by the early 20th century, British railway companies had developed an enormous range of discounted fares in order to grow the market. But just as today, those of you who know the railway system in Britain will understand what I'm saying, there was a downside to all of this from the user's point of view, because market pricing, or quasi-market pricing on the railway, was described by this chap here, he's my favourite commentator at the time, and he's got some splendid French vocabulary there, I seek to emulate him. Emil Davis, who was a left-wing critic of the organisation of railway, of the Edwardian railways, and he described this market pricing as leading to, quote, one mass of absurd anomalies, unquote. A clarion call which I think today's rail consumer watchdogs on the other side of the Irish Sea might care to adopt. Right, well, I'm going to leap a couple of pages, given we're a little bit short of time, and tell you a little bit about what the NRM, the National Railway Museum, did with all the research that the team I showed you before came up with in the three and a bit years of funding that we had. Originally the idea was that the museum would mount an exhibition in the hall, the station hall, actually in the museum itself at York. But in the three and a half years it took us to do the research, technology moved apace, and smartphones and tablets have become comparatively commonplace, and the museum decided, and I think it was quite a sensible decision, to abandon the physical exhibition and develop an app. So you can get this is free, it's only any good if you've got an iPhone. I don't have an iPhone, I have a smartphone, so I've never used it, but people who have got an iPhone tell me it's actually quite good. And this is an app which enables any traveller on the East Coast Main Line from Edinburgh and north of Edinburgh down to London through York, of course, to get geotagged information about the places they're going through. Yeah, well, so what, I hear you say. But the point is that it's geotagged information which is about the way in which the railways historically have marketed those places. So that drew very directly upon the sort of material that we got out of the archives. And in addition to giving visitors a sense of the sort of the posters and the guidebooks and so on that the railway companies developed to encourage people to move to travel to certain destinations, there are also hyperlinks into elements of the NRM's artefact collections, its engineering collections. Unfortunately, this is obviously just screenshots, but these are actually, these enable you to do 360-degree virtual tours of the objects, all from the comfort, in inverted commas, of your standard class or indeed first class seat. That has been successful. It's been downloaded quite a lot of times and has proved an inspiration for other museums elsewhere in Europe. I have one concern, though, about it from my perspective of developing a usable past, developing an understanding of the past that helps us to think about the future. And it's this, that I think most people who use the app as it's being developed will probably think, well, that's great, you know, I can see that in the past, a long way back, earlier than I ever imagined, that railway companies were encouraging us to travel more, and that's how it's always going to be. I suspect that most people will simply project into the future more of the same. And part of what I wanted to do with the exhibition that we were going to mount in the museum, but which we didn't do, was to actually have a final section where we leap ahead about 10 years, or 20 years or whatever, and visitors were going to be confronted with an area in which things had changed. That for whatever reason, people had suddenly, or politicians, or we collectively as a society, had woken up to the fact that we can no longer keep dumping all this carbon in the atmosphere. And we have to think about whether we are going to travel quite as much as we have been in the past. So I think with an app, one of the advantages is that it's relatively cheap to add more to it. And what I'd like to see the National Railway Museum do, although unfortunately I'm no longer in a position directly to influence it, is to add an additional section to the app where effectively, you know, that happens. Maybe when you log on to York, you find a poster from 2024, something along the lines of the ones that we all know from the Second World War. Is your journey really necessary? I think at that point, in the interest of time, I shall stop. But I'd be very interested in any questions or comments.